the challenges for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia has been a long process of challenges in the legal system. I'll start from the beginning of how it all began. So in Australia, they had the doctrine of terra nullius, and that declared Australia that land belonged to nobody. So the Torres Strait Islanders, Eddie Mabo, he was a gardener at the university in Townsville. And there was this lecturer there, and he heard them talking about terra nullius, that the land belonged to no one. Now, Eddie Mabo, he lived in the Torres Strait where they had their language, their traditional practices and everything, and they are part of Queensland. And he said, no, you know, this land has always belonged to me and my family from generation to generation. There is nothing meaning that it never belonged to no one. So Eddie Mabo then challenged it in the court. He took it all the way to the High Court, and for 20 years they fought. He ended up passing away, but it then found, and it got rid of, the high courts in Australia overturned terra nullius, and they found that the land did belong to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. So this was in 1979 when it got overturned. So what's happened now is that native title has now given us recognition to our land. It does not give us full ownership, but it does give us recognition. It's a very tight system to challenge. You have to prove that you have had continuous connection to the land to say that you have native title, that you are recognised to that land. And the sad part is, because of the stolen children and children were removed so much around Australia, that those people can't identify with the land. We're lucky where I am that we lived out in an area, in a remote area, where we were able to prove that we have had continuous connection to the land before Captain Cook arrived here, and that's what it's about. But that recognition only gives us recognition. We cannot make an economic gain on that land. And so you lose your culture, you lose your traditional knowledge when you're removed. So with all of that happening around, the challenges for some of these young people who are now going back to the land, it's hard to identify all the continuous traditional knowledge. With all of this disconnection to our land, and we've had to fight for our land and our removal of, you know, our children and everything, you know, this has caused a lot of grief on us. And it's also it took away our spiritual loss to the land, our spiritual connection to the land. Because as for Indigenous people around the world and in Australia, we have our spiritual loss means our connection, our stories, our strength. It has so much meaning for us. And so in Timber Creek, they challenged it in the High Court and they won $2.3 million. This was 2 years ago, for their spiritual loss to the connection to the land. By winning that case in Timber Creek, it's really opened up a whole meaning for us as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in this country. So now, where I am, the government have decided, well, rather than clogging up the courts, we'll look at doing a compensation framework. So they've gone around to the country, to native title holders who have recognised native title, and they're saying, well, you know, we can give you a compensations, and not for money, but we can give you some sort of infrastructure, like, you know, how much would it be if we put a building in and we said we'll fund that for, say, 30 years, and you have a language centre there to bring back your language. The governments are looking at outlaying a lot of money, and they don't want to clog up their court system. Because, you know, when you have these challenges, sometimes the bar can get even higher in the legal system. And you've got native title cases that have been sitting in there for the last 10 years trying to verify their connection to the land. So they're the challenges, but some of the things that have come out of it that we are recognised as the traditional owners, and now, you know, there's cases where, you know, there's spiritual connection lost to the land. There are a lot of mines on our lands, and there are a lot of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who were removed, and in particular, when you're challenging in the courts for your native title, is that you must show that you know the dancings, that you know the storyline, the dream lines, that you have that traditional knowledge of the area, of the fruits, of the meaning of the land, what those significant meanings were, and how they have been passed on from generation to generation. All of those Aboriginal communities have different tribes in them, so they're going back those tribes to try and say where they come from, because under the Protection Act, I think there's something like 29 Aboriginal communities or 30 communities in Queensland, and on those communities, a lot of people still are not able to own their own homes. A lot of them are now being put on a welfare card. And so what happens is that, you know, there's a lot of health issues in our communities, diabetes, kidney problems, because it's all still government control. Even though we do have our native title and our land rights, we still have a lot of issues. And those issues then fall down to the government control of communities, or the lack of access, the lack of our basic rights to Aboriginal to communities, but then those services on those lands are not fully provided by the government. So, for example, most of the communities in Northern Territory are on bore water, meaning that they get their water from underground, and they have tanks. So some of these bore waters are really salty, and what happens is that it's not good for their health. So that means they then have to use the water tank. So those people then have to go into town to buy their water, as well as they don't have full electricity. They only have generators on most of all the town camps around Northern Territory. So those generators are run by petrol. So the sad part is that in Northern Territory, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people are also on a basic card. So that basic card means that you're on a welfare system where you get a card and you have limited money that you could go and get access to having petrol, or, you know, having the basic things, mobile phones or any of these things. Very huge restrictions still on Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in this country. And where it's government controlled on all these communities, you cannot just ring a plumber and say, you know, my toilet's blocked or something like this. You have to wait and put notice into the Department of Housing for you then to be able to get your shower fixed or something like this. Some places have been waiting for 14 years to get their whole little town camp fully serviced again and everything fixed. So there's these real big issues of still oppression on us, even though we've won that recognition of land. And it's very sad because we have a high rate of kidney dialysis and diabetes out in our communities, because, you know, lack of water then mean you can't grow your own vegetables the way that you want, because these communities, some of them are maybe 10 hours away from a town where you get all the services of everything. And I'll give you an example. Out in Kintor, out in the desert, out on the border of Western Australia and Northern Territory, they didn't want their elders going into Alice Springs, which is maybe about 8-10 hours away. They wanted their elders to be able to pass away out on their communities and to be able to be there and be cared for by their families and everything. So they said to the government, can we have kidney dialysis out here? The government said, if you want kidney dialysis out here, you signed your land back to us on a 99-year lease. Kintor said, no, you know what? We're not going to hand over our land. We're not going to sign our land over again when we've just got everything back. So what they decided to do in their small community, because of their strong traditional culture, they decided that they would do an art show. So they done an art show in Sydney, and they made quite a large amount of money, where they were able to then bring back and put in kidney dialysis machines in their community. They were able to put in bring in a doctor. They were able to create their own help in there without selling their land on a 99-year lease. If you take away the elders from the land, you're then losing your language. You're then losing your culture. And if they're dying in the hospitals in the cities, and the young people out in those communities, that disconnection is lost. So it's really important. So there's that big discrimination. There's that big oppression again of trying to remove people off their land in a subtle way by saying, well, you know, you want your basic health. Anywhere around the world, you will always see Indigenous people, they are marching for their land rights, and for their traditional knowledge to be kept and to be stayed on that land.